In case you were curious, who runs this country? Banks run this country. After what the Wall Street Journal calls, quote, intense lobbying by major banks involving millions of dollars in targeted ads and filet mignon dinners, Congress and the Fed are poised to scale back how much money banks have to set aside as a buffer against taxpayer bailouts. The Wall Street Journal calls the move, quote, a major victory for bankers, noting it signals a, quote, shift in the balance of power between banks and regulators. It will no doubt be refreshing to the average American to discover that major banks actually have a lot more power than we thought. The key issue is how much banks have to set aside for so-called market risk, in other words, their assets going down. This is what wiped out a bevy of major banks last year, from Silicon Valley to Signature, when their government bonds lost a third or more of value to the point their assets were worth less than deposits. So deposits being what banks owe, say, to your grandmother. That means they were bankrupt, and thanks to a very understanding taxpayer, were wound up and sold off to megabanks with all the losses covered. What the bankers want, naturally, is to have zero buffer, so they can lend every last penny to hedge funds with nothing left in the vault. This is fantastically risky, of course, but then bankers know they can force taxpayers to step in when anything goes wrong. And wrong it shall go, given all the billions they got paid for screwing up in 2008 and once again in 2023. In fact, the more pathetic they look, the more pressure they can put on bailouts. After all, when their banker lends all their money to a hedge fund in the Caymans, widows and orphans make for much better human shields if they are actually eating cat food. So far in Washington, they're cutting the bailout buffer, the incremental reserves in a new capital rule, by half, so lopping off $75 billion for banks to hand to shareholders, or more likely lend to hedge funds, instead of covering inevitable losses from lending to those very hedge funds. Meanwhile, across town, Congress just advanced a bill to exempt banks up to $50 billion in assets, so that's close to 5,000 banks, from a slew of capital rules, again intended to protect taxpayers. Keep in mind, bank lobbyists are still hard at work, and of course, for decades now, bankers get everything they want out of Washington. They literally write most bank regulation, including the post-2008 rules that have apparently institutionalized bailouts. So toss in that shift in power, and the incredible shrinking bailout buffer could keep evaporating like vodka martinis at a Wall Street Christmas party. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com. What last year's banking crisis taught us is that banking has not gotten any better since 2008. In fact, it's gotten worse. The gambling with the taxpayer dime, both directly and indirectly via the Fed's so-called lender of last resort function that hands bankers whatever they want if they just produce enough human shields. The difference is that in 2008, the bankers had to come begging. This time, the bailouts are being arranged ahead of time, one filet mignon dinner and one campaign contribution at a time. A new episode of the Roundup podcast just dropped, covering de-dollarization, house prices, the rise of shadow banks, the fall of fast food, and another $300 billion for the Ukraine meat grinder. Check it out at Apple, Spotify, or at Peter St. Ange. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.